This series starts by showing a British warship sailing in the seas near Persia on March 18, 2003. It was just 24 hours before the British SAS Special Air Service special forces on the ship invaded Iraq. John Porter, the operations commander, was chilling with his team as they headed to their destination, Iraq. Before the mission began, John's boss talked to all the soldiers who were going on the mission. Their task was to rescue Kenneth Bratton, a top executive from the weapons company AT&T system. He had been kidnapped 2 weeks earlier while staying in a hotel room in Baghdad City. The tricky part was that the British military didn't know who the kidnappers were. This made the mission very delicate. The British military had two main suspects for the kidnapping: the Iraqi military and the insurgents. Moreover, to kick off the mission, John will be getting help from Captain Hugh Collinson, who's part of military intelligence and knows Arabic. Hugh is also in charge of pinpointing where Kenneth is being held captive. During this time, Hugh shared that he had figured out that Kenneth was likely in a safe house, located in an apartment block in Basra City. He got this info from a reliable source. The clock was ticking because they needed to finish the mission within 24 hours before the Allied forces took action to take down Iraq. Soon after, the team got ready with their weapons, and it looked like John handed his weapon over to Hugh. Once all the preparations were done, John and his team hopped onto a helicopter to reach the safe house where the hostage situation had happened. When they arrived on the rooftop of an apartment building, the special forces got into a shootout with the kidnappers. They kept exchanging gunfire until they located Kenneth, who they quickly moved out of the apartment to safety. But then things got even more complicated when a group of Iraqi soldiers arrived on the scene. This made the hostage rescue operation tougher. During this intense moment, a boy named AZ entered the picture. He had an explosive vest on, with a button to trigger it in his hand. While John could have easily taken down AZ, he chose a different path. He managed to cut the cord connected to the explosive vest, making it harmless, and then rendered AZ unconscious. The escape and rescue mission became even more challenging. John was injured by enemy gunfire in his shoulder. His team encouraged him to go ahead and ensure Kenneth's safety, so he led Kenneth to the helicopter. Meanwhile, the rest of John's team continued to fight off the attackers. The situation escalated further when Colonel Hakim al-Nazari and his forces parachuted in to surround the team. In the meantime, Azad woke up from being unconscious and quickly grabbed his weapon. Before long, shots were fired at 4 members of the British Special Forces. John, who had returned to assist his team, caught sight of Hakim, the Iraqi colonel leading the attack. It turns out Hakim was on a wanted list. As John approached his team, he was shocked to find that 3 of his members had been shot. He immediately instructed the remaining members to head back to the ship. After the mission was successfully completed, 2 soldiers were declared dead, and 1 was in critical condition. Back on the ship, John and Hugh had a conversation about Azad, suspecting that he was the one who had shot 3 soldiers. John admitted that he didn't shoot Azad, even though his superiors had ordered him to. Unfortunately, it seemed like his decision was wrong. When John returned to help his team, he saw Azad holding a gun. John also asked Hugh about what Azad had said to him earlier. Hugh mentioned that Azad had told him he owed John his life. Sometime later, the invasion of Iraq was still ongoing, but John had to stay in the hospital to recover from the gunshot wound he sustained. His wife, Diane Porter, and daughter, Alexandra Lexi Porter, were there with him in the treatment room. Meanwhile, John's colleague, Steve Andrews, who was shot in the head, remained in critical condition. The doctors explained that removing the bullet from his head could put his life at risk. After he got better, John had to face his superior, who was disappointed with how John had acted. He hadn't followed orders during the mission to rescue Kenneth, which resulted in the deaths of 2 soldiers. Because of this incident, military investigators conducted an investigation in the field. Eventually, John made the choice to resign instead of being fired from the military. He applied for a job at Kenneth's company. Unfortunately, even though John's team had rescued Kenneth, he didn't appreciate it. Instead of showing gratitude, Kenneth belittled John and offered him a security position, which really bothered John. He even smashed an office window out of frustration. On top of all this, after losing his job, John also felt distanced from his wife and daughter. Jumping 7 years ahead, we find a British journalist named Katie Dartmouth stationed in Iraq. She's covering the ongoing violence, even though the invasion has ended. While reporting in the area, Katie senses a young man watching her. Later, on her way home with her coverage team, they get stopped by a group posing as Iraqi police. Among them is the same young man who had been observing Katie earlier. She tries to take his photo, but before she knows it, the group attacks her colleagues and kidnaps her. Switching to the intelligence headquarters led by the now promoted Major Hugh, his assistant Layla Thompson reports Katie's abduction. They're trying to figure out the reasons behind the kidnapping and any possible link to Katie's father, a former British official. They have a photo of the young man involved in the kidnapping, which they acquired. When Hugh sees the photo, he recognizes the young man as Azad. On another occasion, Hugh receives a call from his superior, James Middleton, asking him to come and meet Patrick Dartmouth, Katie's father and a former Secretary of State. The reason is that Hugh has been assigned the responsibility of leading Katie's rescue mission. During the meeting, Patrick discusses his plan to have British Special Forces rescue his daughter if the kidnappers don't make ransom demands. James proposes an idea. They could publish Azad's photo in the Iraqi media, hoping that locals might come forward with information in exchange for a reward. After the meeting, Hugh heads home from the office and by chance spots John, who's working in security. John's job keeps him very occupied, and his relationship with Lexi seems to be growing distant. Lexi appears to be drifting away from her father and doesn't seem too concerned about his life. On one occasion, John watches the news about Katie's kidnapping and sees a photo of the kidnapper. He recognizes the kidnapper as Azad, the same young man who was believed to have killed 3 of his fellow team members during a previous mission. On the other side, Katie remained confined in a dim room. Eventually, Hakim, the mastermind behind the kidnapping, arrived along with Azad. They recorded a video of Katie and released it, making demands on the British government. Their demand was to release their brother, Mohammed Jassim Ali, and they threatened to execute Katie if their demand wasn't met. In the video, they set a deadline for the British government to respond. After conducting a search, Layla informed Hugh that Jassim was already in Belmarsh prison for his involvement in terrorism. Hugh then instructed Layla to dig into the IP address used by the kidnapper to upload the video. The team had only 7 days to locate and rescue Katie before the kidnappers carried out their threat of executing her. Time was of the essence. Shortly after, John visited the headquarters to meet with Hugh. He expressed his strong belief that the circulated photo of Katie's kidnapper was indeed Azad. In a covert move, Layla tried to overhear their conversation. During their meeting, John showed Hugh a photo of Hakim, the former head of security in the Iraqi secret police. This man had orchestrated attacks on John's previous team. The puzzling part was Hakim had never been arrested during the invasion of Iraq, despite being behind multiple attacks on British troops. John began to suspect that Hakim might be the mastermind behind Katie's kidnapping. He speculated that the kidnapper could be using the safe house in Basra as Katie's location. John proposed to Hugh that he be sent to Iraq as an undercover operative. This way, Hugh could deploy special forces for the rescue mission. John was ready to take on the risk, even if it meant this mission could be his last. Moreover, John wanted to meet Azad to uncover the truth about the shooter from their previous mission, the one who had allegedly killed 3 of John's team members. He was determined to get answers and to ensure justice. Inside the confinement area, Hakim reveals to Katie that he sees her father as a dishonest figure, accusing him of being a British and American liar. This is why he chose her as his abduction target. After leaving the confinement area, Azad, who is Hakim's nephew, apologizes for his photos being circulated, as it has made it easier for the British to track them down. On the flip side, Hugh and Layla provide an update to James about the ongoing investigation into Katie's kidnapping. They highlight the challenges in solving the case, particularly because the criminal group involved is highly skilled. Even the military struggles to trace the original IP address used by the kidnappers. Given the circumstances, Hugh informs James about his plan to send John to Iraq to handle the kidnapping case. John, a former commander of British Special Forces who has experience in rescuing hostages in Iraq, seems to be the best military option. James agrees to use John's services, even though Layla points out that John has been off duty for 8 years and is dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. Acting swiftly, the British military quickly reactivated John as a soldier, Before he could be deployed to Iraq, John underwent a series of combat skill tests and had tracking devices installed in his teeth. These devices would make it easier for other teams to monitor his actions during the rescue operation. A few hours later, Hakim released another live video. This time, they expressed their frustration, implying that they wanted a ransom from the UK government. Shockingly, during the live broadcast, they cut off Katie's arm as a gruesome display of their seriousness. In the midst of this crisis, Layla asks Hugh if their team can manage to trace the IP address of the kidnapper. The urgency is increasing as the situation becomes more dire. Having gathered the necessary data, Lieutenant Layla, along with the Special Forces Alpha team, gets ready to head to Iraq for Katie's rescue mission. Meanwhile, John is placed on alert at the American base located in Basra City. In Iraq, John awaits further orders from the military as the Alpha team prepares to move to the captivity site. On the other side, Hakim appears calm, observing Katie, who is in a helpless situation. Despite knowing that British Special Forces are planning an attack on his location, he remains composed. When Layla and the Alpha squad reach the site, some team members swiftly enter the building to execute an ambush, while Layla monitors the situation from inside a helicopter. Unfortunately, an unexpected explosion occurs, resulting in the loss of all team members. It becomes clear that the ambush plan has failed. Now, the only hope for the British military is for John to take action. Layla quickly tracks John's movements using the tracking device implanted in his teeth. Although John is taking action without official permission, Hugh decides not to arrest him. Hugh recognizes that John, his former colleague, has waited 7 years for a second chance to prove his abilities and make a difference. John enters the safe house he had been to 7 years ago to rescue Kenneth. As he breaks through the door, memories of his past mission flood back. Determined not to repeat any mistakes, he proceeds cautiously, weapon in hand. With the weight of his previous mission on his mind, John navigates the space, ensuring he remains undetected. He manages to incapacitate one member of the kidnapper group, aiming to extract information about Hakim's whereabouts. However, the man resists, forcing John to subdue him and render him unconscious. Taking the man's cell phone, John contacts a name in the phone's contacts list, mentioning Hakim. This cunning move is intended to lure other members of the kidnapper group to the safe house. The plan works, and several men arrive. John takes them down swiftly, finally extracting information about the captivity location from one of the kidnappers who remains conscious. En route to Katie's location, John shares the details with Layla about where she's being held captive. He also takes a moment to discreetly hide a rubber-covered folding knife in a concealed spot on his body. Upon arriving at the site, John decides to make a risky move. He feigns desperation and offers himself up to the kidnappers. As a result, he's attacked by several men. One of them eventually informs Hakim that John inquired about Jassim's whereabouts. In response, Hakim orders his men to retrieve the tracking device that was used to monitor John's movements. Azad, who witnesses this scene, can only remain silent. Soon after, the tracking device implanted in John's teeth is forcibly removed, causing Layla to lose the ability to track her colleague's location. As John is about to be moved to another location, he spots Katie, who is being transported in a separate car. Meanwhile, back at headquarters, Hugh and the team face confusion. They've lost track of John, and the precarious situation posed by Hakim's group makes it unsafe to hastily deploy a team. On a different occasion, Hugh met with Diane and Lexi to explain John's mission in Iraq. Lexi appeared irritated by Hugh's decision to involve her father in such a dangerous mission. She reluctantly came to terms with the possibility of her father facing peril on the battlefield. At the captivity site, when John received a bottle of drink from Azad, he recalled Azad's words from 7 years ago that he owed his life to John. Azad, upon hearing this, seemed taken aback and fell silent in response to John's words. A while later, while still being held captive, John tried to reassure Katie by revealing his identity as a member of the British Special Forces. He aimed to give her hope and comfort in the midst of their dire situation. When Hakim's group arrived, John was subjected to an interrogation. They positioned him on his back and splashed water on his face, making it difficult for him to breathe. John refused to answer Hakim's questions about his purpose in Iraq. To force him to talk, Hakim resorted to torturing Katie in front of John. They whipped her, and she lost consciousness as a result. Despite this, John still didn't provide the answers Hakim sought. Frustrated, Hakim threatened to expedite their execution, set for the following morning. After John was returned to his confinement, he promptly retrieved the knife he had hidden earlier and used it to cut the ropes binding his hands. Meanwhile, Hugh dispatched his troops to the last known location where John's tracking signal had been detected. After successfully freeing himself from his restraints, John made a promise to Katie that he would lead her back to safety in England. Simultaneously, Layla, who was part of the investigative effort, discovered the fingertips of Katie's hand. This finding led her to conclude that both John and Katie were still alive, despite the difficult circumstances they were facing. The following morning, Layla employs a helicopter in her search for John and Katie's location. Unfortunately, the kidnappers have taken Katie to a room where her execution is to take place. John, aware of this imminent danger, attempts to break down the door of the execution room. He realizes that the execution is to be carried out live and intervenes just in time. He starts taking out the kidnappers one by one, preventing Katie's execution. Simultaneously, Hakim enters the room with the intention to execute Katie. Azad, holding a weapon, remains silent and hesitant to fire at John. Amidst the chaos, John manages to immobilize Hakim and then eliminates the leader of the group. John also disarms Azad and questions him about the shooter responsible for the deaths of 3 members of his team in the past. Azad confesses that he wasn't the one who shot them. Just as Azad is about to reveal the identity of the actual shooter, other members of a radical group appear suddenly, forcing John to act swiftly. In a critical moment, John takes Katie and Azad to safety in a car parked nearby, managing to escape from the dangerous situation at the building. The radical group continued to chase them, prompting John to contact Layla for assistance. While awaiting Layla's team, John halted the car and engaged in a firefight with the pursuing radicals until he ran out of ammunition. Fortunately, Layla's team arrived in time to rescue John, Katie, and Azad. However, Hugh, who was monitoring from the base, instructed Layla to bring back only John and Katie. Hugh was concerned that Azad, who had witnessed the tragic incident where John's team was killed in the past, might reveal the truth. This decision angered John, especially since Azad was now being pursued by Iraqi radical groups. With the successful rescue of Katie, John returned home to reunite with his wife and daughter. He also visited Katie in the hospital during her recovery. There, Katie revealed to John that the person responsible for shooting 3 members of his team was a soldier. This revelation piqued John's curiosity, and he wanted to know more about what she meant. Shifting to Zimbabwe, a maintenance worker named Felix Masuku and his partner, a sniper, positioned themselves on a building rooftop to carry out an attempt on the life of the Zimbabwean president, Mugabe, who was giving a speech in another building. Colonel Shuma, the head of presidential security, was present, monitoring the situation. As Mugabe was about to leave the building and return to his car, Felix took the shot, hitting the president. Quickly, he and his partner fled the scene. Reaching their getaway car, they were shocked to discover their colleague, who was waiting in the car, had been killed by a gunshot. Soon after, Shuma's forces arrived, launching an attack on Felix and his partner. Amid the ensuing firefight, Felix's partner was killed, and Felix himself became immobilized as Zimbabwean military soldiers surrounded him. The shooting incident quickly became a headline on television news. However, it was revealed that the victim of the shooting was not President Mugabe himself, but rather his twin. The Zimbabwean government responded by accusing the British government of orchestrating the attack. This prompted Hugh to promptly meet with James to discuss the situation in Zimbabwe. Based on the available information, it was revealed that Felix, the perpetrator, was a former British Marine. He had lost his parents to Mugabe's army, which led him to leave Zimbabwe when he was 18 and move to England, where he eventually joined the military. 6 years prior to the shooting, Felix decided to return to Zimbabwe. This decision of Felix led the Zimbabwean government to point fingers at Britain, alleging their involvement in the attack. Following the meeting, Hugh returns to headquarters and assigns John with the task of freeing Felix, who has been imprisoned in Chikurubi prison by the local government. Layla will serve as John's contact in South Africa for this mission. To carry out the operation, John assumes the identity of an illegal diamond trader named John Dean. He also studies a blueprint of Chikurubi prison, as the facility is known to be heavily guarded. Hugh clarifies that while Britain was not involved in the assassination, it's crucial to prevent Felix from remaining in prison. Mugabe could exploit Felix's imprisonment to tarnish Britain's reputation on the global stage. Additionally, Hugh requests that Felix be neutralized before his trial begins in court. Before departing, Hugh also shares with John that Azad's body has not been found, which raises suspicions between them regarding Azad's situation. Shortly afterward, Agent Danny Prendeville provides John with a new identity, complete with a passport in preparation for the mission. In a different vein, Layla has a meeting with Hugh regarding the mission to both rescue and eliminate Felix. Surprisingly, it's revealed that Felix is a fellow member of the SAS Special Forces, just like John. Felix had also become a British intelligence agent in Zimbabwe. Layla expresses frustration over Hugh keeping information from John, but she realizes she cannot defy her superior's orders. Afterward, John arrived in Zimbabwe and established contact with an illegal diamond-dealing mafia to initiate the transaction. Concurrently, Layla met with the British ambassador in Zimbabwe, Harry Curtis, to acquire a new identity for herself. She posed as an Interpol agent specializing in narcotics and smuggling cases. As for John, once the diamond transaction was concluded, law enforcement intervened. The mafia member was shot and killed by the police, while John was apprehended and subsequently incarcerated in Chikurubi prison. Upon arriving at the prison, John and the other new inmates underwent inspection by the warden to ensure no dangerous items were brought into the cells. The warden was quick to punish anyone found with weapons, resorting to beatings. John found himself sharing a cell with a young inmate named Solongo, who introduced himself. Unfortunately, Solongo was frequently subjected to attacks by other inmates. At midnight, while John was sleeping, a group of inmates assaulted Solongo. John intervened to defend the young man, leading to a brawl. The situation escalated and the warden intervened, dragging John away, seemingly to face severe consequences. Just before the execution was about to take place, John managed to halt the proceedings by claiming he had valuable information about Felix. The head warden then summoned John before Felix. In a tense moment, Felix denied knowing John and infuriated the head warden, who was on the verge of attacking John with a hammer. Fortunately, Shuma intervened to prevent the violence. Layla arrived at the prison in time to rescue John, bringing him to South Africa. During their conversation, Layla and John communicated using a prearranged code. John informed Layla about Felix's presence in the prison and shared crucial information. Following her meeting with John, Layla promptly informed Hugh about Felix's impending transfer to a cell beneath the courthouse. She emphasized the urgency of John's mission to extract Felix from the prison. When John met Felix in the prison yard, he assured Felix that he was there to facilitate his escape. Felix, placing his trust in John's words, shared the location code of his cell to aid in planning the escape. Meanwhile, Layla worked on preparing the necessary release documentation for John. Back in the prison yard, other inmates challenged John to prove his strength by fighting Vincent, considered the toughest prisoner. The warden seemed to manipulate the situation by secretly providing Vincent with a knife. As the fight commenced, Vincent managed to knock John down initially. Refusing to accept defeat, John got back up and fought back, eventually overpowering Vincent. Solongo, witnessing the concealed knife, retrieved it and discreetly handed it to John. On a different occasion, Layla met John in prison and discreetly placed an item under the meeting table before his arrival. As John joined her, she quickly provided him with a code for immediate action, urging him to escape and eliminate Felix. Layla had also arranged essential documents and a getaway vehicle for John's escape plan. Following their meeting, Layla handed John's release documents to Shuma. However, Shuma sensed something amiss with the documents and grew suspicious of Layla's identity, prompting him to verify her claim of being an Interpol officer. The next morning, Shuma received an email revealing the falsified identity Layla had used for her disguise. He realized she had deceived him. In the meantime, John initiated his escape plan by incapacitating 2 officers assigned to take him to the fight field. He then reached Felix and subdued several guards on duty. Around the same time, Layla arrived at the prison and discovered her cover was blown. She abandoned her initial plan to assist John and Felix in their escape. John and Felix struggled to break free from the prison through a secret path that John had memorized from the prison blueprint. Simultaneously, Shuma learned about John and Felix's escape and reacted angrily by fatally shooting the warden. Using his keen memory, John successfully helps Felix escape from prison. However, they discover that the car Layla had intended for their escape is nowhere to be found. Faced with guards and roadblocks, John decides to steal a car to avoid pursuit. Opting for mountain roads to evade capture, they eventually reach a deserted street. John prepares to carry out his orders from Hugh to eliminate Felix and even has a prepared grade for the act. In a tense moment, Felix reveals a surprising truth: he was manipulated and framed. He claims that he was originally hired by British intelligence to assassinate Mugabe, but he was betrayed by someone, similar to how John felt betrayed by Layla's failure to provide a getaway car. Upon hearing Felix's explanation, John decides not to kill him. Instead, they prepare to evade the relentless pursuit of Zimbabwean special forces who are determined to capture them. On the other hand, Shuma mobilizes his military forces and enlists the help of tracking experts from South Africa to assist in the hunt for John and Felix. Layla receives a surprising contact from John, who has changed his mind about executing Felix due to the valuable information he possesses. Felix reveals that he knows about a legal contract that implicates the British government in the assassination plot against Mugabe. Recognizing the significance of this revelation, Layla agrees to meet John and Felix near the border the following afternoon, away from the watchful eyes of the Zimbabwean military. In the meantime, John urges Felix to leave immediately. Felix discards a rifle he had been carrying into a hole that was initially meant for burying his own body. Their escape becomes urgent as they try to evade capture and reach the meeting point with Layla. At the headquarters, Hugh learns from Layla about Felix's unexpected involvement and his claim about the British government's role in the assassination plot. Hugh approaches James to seek the truth behind Felix's claims. James confirms that Felix was indeed recruited for the assassination mission, but the order did not originate from their office. They realize the need to verify whether Felix is telling the truth or if he's been manipulated into falsely implicating the British government. As John and Felix continue their escape through the Zimbabwean wilderness, they find themselves navigating the challenging terrain to evade capture by the pursuing forces. In the meantime, the shaman's supernatural abilities allow the Zimbabwean troops to track their path, making their escape even more difficult. Hugh assigns Danny to uncover the mastermind behind the plot involving Felix. Danny's investigation takes her on a search for leads, trying to uncover the truth behind the assassination mission and the involvement of the British government. Back in the forest, John and Felix try to stay ahead of their pursuers by walking on rocks to obscure their footprints. They also opt for asphalt roads to avoid leaving clear trails for the shaman to follow. Despite their efforts, the shaman's mystical tracking abilities prove to be a formidable obstacle, and they find themselves doubling back into the forest. Their journey takes them to a cliff, where they must make a decision on how to proceed. With the danger closing in and their options running out, John and Felix must strategize and act quickly to escape the shaman's grasp and reach safety. Surrounded by the Zimbabwean army, they had to fight back and then made a quick decision to jump into the river from the cliff. Thankfully, they didn't get hurt and found a hiding spot under some trees. Helicopters from the Zimbabwean army were flying over the river, trying to find them. John checked their stuff, but Layla's radio got wet, so they couldn't reach her. They looked around using binoculars as they were thinking about going to South Africa for their escape. In the office, Danny tells Hugh that Harry is the one who told Felix to kill Mugabe. According to the info, Harry worked at the British Embassy in South Africa and got $5 million from a Swiss bank connected to a Zimbabwean minister. With this info, Hugh plans to go to South Africa and meet Harry. Out in the forest, John and Felix spot a gang-controlled orphanage where a nun is being bothered. John gives Felix a knife to take out the gang, while he watches outside. They have a shootout and Felix gets hurt, but they manage to beat the gang and save the nun. John tries using the phone there, but it's not working to reach Layla. He also buries the dead gang members to cover their tracks and keep the orphanage safe from more attacks. After talking to the nurse in charge of the orphanage, John learned about a gang that used the orphanage to smuggle people into Africa. The nurse shared that the gang had kidnapped some orphanage kids, forcing her to let them use the place. John, feeling sorry for the situation, decided to rescue the captive kids, while Felix stayed back to tend to his injured leg. At the riverbank, John got upset seeing the bodies of refugees killed by the gang. He became more determined to take down the gang. Using his binoculars, he scoped out the area, and then he attacked, freeing the captive orphanage kids. The gang members fought back when they discovered their friends were dead, leading to a shootout between John and the gang. In South Africa, Harry seems skilled at scheming when Hu presents evidence of his collaboration with Chuma to frame Felix for the president's assassination in Zimbabwe. Despite having the chance to apprehend Harry, Hu offers him the opportunity to become a double agent and expose Chuma. However, Harry declines, choosing a different path. Switching to John, who is still dealing with numerous bandits, he manages to rescue all the orphanage children, even though he's been wounded. The remaining bandits flee from the scene. Meanwhile, Hu continues his investigation, searching through Harry's laptop. He discovers proof that Harry was responsible for revealing Layla's identity to Chuma. At the orphanage, the nurse and Felix, who saw John returning injured, quickly attended to his wounds. Meanwhile, the shaman and 2 Zimbabwean soldiers discovered bullet traces left behind by John. Spotting them, John and Felix got ready to confront the soldiers. They managed to take down the 2 soldiers easily, but the shaman sensed danger and escaped to inform Chuma. Following the incident, John instructed the nurse and the orphanage children to head to the South African border immediately. He and Felix stayed behind, anticipating that Zimbabwean soldiers might surround the area in about 2 hours. They readied themselves, gathered weapons from the orphanage, and devised a plan to face the incoming enemy forces. After 2 hours, Chuma and his troops arrived at the location. A fierce gunfight erupted between the Zimbabwean soldiers and the 2 British Special Forces operatives. Some soldiers were also dispatched to attack from the rear of the orphanage, but Felix managed to eliminate them all. Seeing that the enemy numbers were increasing, John and Felix strategically retreated, luring the soldiers into a trap they had prepared earlier. As they moved away, an explosion occurred, taking out several soldiers. In response, Chuma ordered his remaining troops to launch RPG attacks on their targets. Felix and John fought on despite being trapped, keeping 1 bullet in their weapons as a last resort. Unexpectedly, South African forces led by Hu arrived to rescue them. Chuma, who was close to killing Hu, was subdued by John's swift action. Once Hu and John reunited, Felix decided to depart, wanting to distance himself from British intelligence. However, John's frustration with Hu boiled over, and he confronted his superior, expressing his discontent that he had received no support from headquarters during his prison escape. Afterwards, John took the time to contact his family, particularly Dani, who informed him that Lexi's surgery to remove a tumor did not go well. She hoped he could return to the UK soon. 2 weeks later, Layla visited John to learn more about the events during Kenneth's rescue mission years ago, which had resulted in the deaths of John's team members. Switching to Afghanistan's southern Helmand province, American forces in contact with Afghan insurgent groups sought assistance from headquarters to deploy warplanes. On the rebel side, an IT expert named Jerry Baxter was hacking the fighter's weapon system. He managed to change the missile target from the rebel group to American troops, posing a dangerous threat. At the M16 headquarters in Britain, the Americans began to blame Britain for the hacking of their fighter system. The system had been developed by a British IT team that had previously claimed it was unhackable. Layla had also gathered information about Jerry, a hacker with expertise in missile guidance software engineering. He was the main suspect in a village explosion caused by his actions. Due to this incident, John was tasked with going to Afghanistan undercover as an arms dealer to apprehend Jerry. Upon arriving in the conflict-ridden country, John attempted to sell modern weaponry to a local governor. Unfortunately, they weren't interested in the weapons he was offering. However, when John mentioned a hacker who could access the LTD encryption code software called Brimstone Laser Missile Guide, their interest was piqued. This weapon was planned to be used by ISF troops or peacekeeping forces under NATO's supervision to address security issues in conflict regions like Afghanistan. Shortly after the negotiation, John found himself arrested and taken to a desolate mountain area. In the meantime, an American representative named Frank Allington arrived at the M16 headquarters to demand an explanation from Hu about Gary's suspected missile hacking activities. Hugh informed Frank that his team was in the process of bringing Jerry back to the UK, and Frank asked for details about their arrest plans. While John was being taken by the rebel group, the American military on a reconnaissance mission spotted him entering the rebel group's headquarters. Inside the headquarters, John encountered Jerry, who was using the alias Joseph Muhammad. Jerry tested John's claim of being an arms dealer by asking about the software they had discussed earlier. Some rebel members were ready to shoot John if he couldn't answer the question satisfactorily. As John struggled to answer, the situation became tense, but suddenly American troops intervened and opened fire. John managed to shield Jerry, and they were both apprehended and taken to the American military headquarters. During the process of photographing Jerry's face, he vehemently resisted, seemingly reluctant to reveal his true identity. Back in England, Hugh learned about the arrest of John and Jerry and attempted to secure their release by meeting with Frank, the American official. However, his efforts were in vain as the American official declined to hand over the two detainees. On another corner of the scene, John and Jerry were being transported to an execution site. However, John fought back and managed to kill 2 American Marines. He destroyed his tracking device to avoid being traced by the American military. During their escape, John questioned Jerry about the reasons behind the Americans' determination to eliminate him. Jerry revealed that he used to work for the CIA and was involved in hacking missile guidance systems in Pakistan. He was abducted by an insurgent group 18 months ago and was coerced into working for them. The current group he's affiliated with, led by Zahir Shark, aims to overthrow the Afghan government. Due to this, the Americans are determined to capture and eliminate him. Jerry proposed taking John to meet Zahir Shark, the leader of the insurgent group in Pakistani territory. Hugh confronts Frank after uncovering the American officials' sinister plan to shift blame onto Britain for the deaths of their soldiers and to cover up the CIA's mistake in recruiting Jerry. Shocked by these revelations, Hugh insists that John and Jerry be returned to British custody. However, he is surprised to learn that the two have managed to escape. John and Jerry are now in hiding, carefully avoiding detection by an American military helicopter that flies overhead. Jerry contacts Zahir's associates for assistance. They remain cautious as they notice an American drone patrolling the area. On the other hand, Hugh mobilizes his team to locate John and Jerry before the Americans can capture them. In Pakistani territory, John and Jerry are picked up by Zahir's men, who lead them to the rebel group's headquarters. The place is heavily guarded by armed forces. Surprisingly, Zahir himself is the same man John encountered when he was trying to make a weapon deal with the governor. John seizes the opportunity to negotiate a business deal with Zahir, but Jerry exposes John's true identity as a member of the British Special Forces. This leads to John's arrest, unless he agrees to share all the information he knows about the British intelligence agency's plans. John tries to convince Jerry that he's not part of the British military, but Jerry remains suspicious. In an attempt to find evidence, Jerry grabs John's belt and discovers a family photo, which deeply affects him. John implores Jerry to reconsider and return to England, as Zahir has manipulated him for his own agenda. While Jerry is in his room, contemplating his family photo and struggling with his decisions, suddenly he overhears a secret conversation between Zahir and Frank about a plan involving an exchange of people for information and war equipment. Jerry quickly copies the evidence of this conspiracy onto his flash drive. On a different front, Frank convinces Hugh that he intends to eliminate John and Jerry due to their involvement in the deaths of 2 American Marines. Back to John, he's once again pressured by Zahir to reveal the ISAF command and control encryption code. Zahir even orders Jerry to shoot John if he refuses to cooperate. John remains silent, and in a surprising turn of events, Jerry shoots Zahir and escapes with John. While Steve, who had been in a coma for 7 years, sadly passed away. Layla, who was at the hospital, asked the doctor to remove the bullet from Steve's head and requested the autopsy results to uncover the truth about his colleague's death. Back with John and Jerry, during their escape, Jerry showed John the flash drive containing evidence of Zahir's deal with the Americans to exchange them for weapons. Upon learning this, John immediately contacted M16 headquarters to share the information he obtained from Jerry. Hugh instructed John to head back to Afghanistan, where British troops would pick them up. Layla also privately informed John about Steve's death and her efforts to uncover the truth behind his shooting. Despite the sadness of the news, John focused on his mission. As for Hugh, he confronted Frank after discovering his deal with the Afghan insurgent group. However, Frank remained composed and left the MI6 agent without giving away much information. As John and Jerry continued their journey by car, they suddenly encountered two armed women who took control of the vehicle. This forced both men to abandon the car and proceed on foot into Afghanistan. At M16 headquarters, Frank meets with Hugh to inform him that he intends to hand over John and Jerry to an American prison. He doesn't shy away from admitting his cooperation with Zahir, as the American government believes that Zahir holds significant influence in Afghanistan. Despite Hugh's efforts, he is left with no choice but to reveal the location where John and Jerry will be picked up by the Americans. Shortly after, Danny handed over the results of the ballistic report on the bullet extracted from Steve's head to Layla. The report revealed the true shooter, and Layla now knew who was responsible. In another instance, Layla reacted angrily upon learning that Hugh had disclosed John and Jerry's pickup location to Frank. She was upset that Hugh had readily put his own men in danger. Layla confronted Hugh about his actions, revealing that she had also discovered that he was the one who had shot Steve and the others during the 2003 mission. Layla threatened to expose this evidence to their superiors unless Hugh took action to save John. With no other option, Hugh decides to fly to Afghanistan to intervene. Meanwhile, John and Jerry are getting closer to the pickup point that Hugh had provided earlier. However, they have to navigate through a dangerous minefield. While crossing, Jerry accidentally steps on a mine, but fortunately, John manages to save him from the explosion. Just as Jerry starts to feel relieved, a sniper shoots him dead. In response, John eliminates the sniper and contacts Layla for assistance. During this conversation, Layla reveals the identity of the shooter behind the attack on Steve and the others, which infuriates John and fuels his desire to confront Hugh, who has now arrived in Afghanistan. In the final moments of the series, John arrives at the designated meeting spot, and Hugh confesses to his past actions while aiming a gun at John. John tries to confront him and manages to overpower Hugh, forcing him to admit that he accidentally shot John's teammates out of fear when they were surrounded by the enemy. In a moment of truth, Hugh apologizes for his mistake. Suddenly, enemy forces surround and launch an attack. Hugh gets injured during the assault. Realizing the dire situation, he urges John to escape in a vehicle while he sacrifices himself by detonating an explosive to eliminate the approaching enemy troops. The moral of the story is do not trust snipers with shaky aim, even if they're your superior.